Marx wrote about capitalism right from its very beginning, from the time it was born. This is what gave him such a powerful vantage point to critique the system that would come to dominate the world by the barrel of a gun. At the heart of the British Industrial Revolution that ushered in capitalism was the Enclosure movement, a policy that created the industrial working class, which allowed the factories and wage labor to exist. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. We need to go back to where it all began: feudalism. In feudalism, or peasant society if you prefer, things worked much differently. Peasants produced mainly for themselves. They worked the land that was owned by the lord and dedicated a portion of their product to him because he owned the land and promised them protection in exchange. But there was another kind of land, common land, which anyone could use for any purpose. Often it was used for grazing animals, cutting peat, turf, or cutting wood. It was vital for the survival of peasants. This land was a reserved right for anyone to use, and this is how it was for as long as anyone could remember. However, the day came when the lords no longer wanted this area to be free for public use. They wanted it for themselves, to make money. Specifically, they wanted that land for the production of crops, for profit, and for the wool industry. To achieve this, a new set of laws were put into place called the ENCLOSURE movement. This occurred from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The peasants were forced off the land which they needed to survive. The land was all fenced in, people were physically forced off the land, and many were killed. It was turned from a shared resource to privately owned property. A significant portion of the peasants could no longer manage their survival and began rebellions against the change. Enclosure began the era of the agricultural revolution in Britain. Once enclosed, the farmer assigned to it could use more advanced farming techniques, producing greater crop yields and livestock output. This led to a surplus of labor, and peasants were no longer needed in such numbers and couldn't survive off the land. These displaced people moved into the now growing cities where factories were appearing, giving birth to the industrial proletariat. People who once produced for themselves now produced for the profits of others. This is how peasants were turned into the working class. This model was eventually adopted all over Europe, but not before the British had forced this on the colonies to a similar effect. The main targets of the Enclosure movement were Ireland, India, and the Americas. In Ireland, the common land was taken by British landlords. That land was then used to produce a seasonal cash crop, the potato. The Irish people were peasants tied to that land, working it for the British lords. But in 1845 to 1852, a potato blight, fungus, struck the country, destroying the food source for 1/3 of the population. 1 million died of starvation and disease, while 2 million more immigrated. Despite still growing some food, the British lords demanded that the product go to Great Britain, where there was a better market price for it: oats, bacon, butter, and livestock. As crops failed, Irish peasants were forced off the land so that lords could use that land for cattle grazing, which was more profitable, leaving even more Irish people destitute and starving. This was repeated in India as well. Millions of Indian people were forced off their land through aggressive land taxation, forced commercialization of agriculture, and outright annexation of princely estates, causing widespread displacement, poverty, and starvation. These policies included the doctrine of lapse, destroyed traditional livelihoods, while the 1947 partition forced a further 15 million from their homes. Farmers were compelled to grow cash crops for export, destroying subsistence agriculture and leading to food shortages. The British East India Company seized territories of rulers without male heirs, as in Jhansi, causing widespread unemployment among elites and their dependents. The local industry was forcibly destroyed so that the local population was dependent upon imports from British manufacturers. Capitalism did not come into existence peacefully, giving people choice and freedom, as it is constantly hailed by free marketeers. It arrived soaked in the blood of the poor. It was born out of forcing people to no longer produce for themselves, but to be forced to produce for the profit of others. And it all began with taking away common land from people who used it collectively to survive.